All right, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today on behalf of the LAMP team. And they also asked me to provide a little bit more of an introduction on the Exosphere and its connections to the volatile questions. I'll need the first slide here, if you can go back for me. I'll broaden my talk here. I'm not on the first slide, excuse me. Oh, yeah. It would be a challenge to give the talk backwards. Never had to do that before. So LAMP stands for the Lyman Alpha Mapping Project. It's a UV spectrograph on LRO, and I'm currently the deputy PI. And today I'll talk to you more about the UV albedos that we've measured with LAMP. All right, I'll give a brief introduction on the Exosphere, like I said, and then I'll jump to a couple different topics. So I'll show you here where I'm going. Talk about L-cross plume gas results, LAMP helium detections that are really exciting to us right now, some searches for horizon glow dust and some upper limits we have on that, and then talk more about volatile transports, connections to the surface, particularly in terms of the PSRs that we've studied, and come up with diagnostic porosity measurements and surface water frost information. So we'll take these one at a time. But I just want to start by saying that this is a really exciting time to be studying the lunar exosphere and volatiles. If someone would have told you, 5 years ago that 1/3 of the talks at a meeting like this, focused on the moon, would be related to exospheres and volatiles, they'd say you're crazy. Who in this community cares about such a topic? So we are, really fortunate to have some really great tools in place to study these questions, which we now know are more relevant than anyone had imagined back then. And we heard some great talks on Artemis and the upcoming LAD mission earlier today, so I won't dwell too much on those topics. And I just want to say that these exosphere and volatile topics have broad applications throughout the solar system, and the moon's a good place to study the basic microphysics involved in these types of things. So let's go over again some sources for the lunar exosphere. Surface sputtering is caused by solar wind interactions, and solar wind's also implanted within the surface where it undergoes some chemical reactions. Cosmic rays and solar energetic particles come in and interact in the surface, and there are some interesting crater results that Rich von Drack mentioned earlier on that topic. Photon-stimulated desorption is another important source for sodium and other constituents. And micrometeorite bombardments are an endogenic source of materials that also vaporize the surface. There are sources of gas from below the surface, and these diffuse upwards from radiogenic materials or more primordial gases that were trapped beneath the surface upon formation. And for each of these different processes, I'll say that there are more complicated microphysics and interactions that go along with each of these that are difficult to study with observations and require often lab experiments to understand more fully. And then there are more assorted endogenic episodic processes like comets that impact the surface and deliver water and carbon monoxide and such. Other impactors like L-cross, and hopefully the Herschel spacecraft will end its mission by smashing into the South Pole of the Moon. That's a new development that we're all working on. And then when landers come and kick up dust and other materials that they expose, that's a source of a more episodic burst of materials. And as Rich von Drack and others have studied, astronauts, when they have opulent, deposits, they can populate the lunar exosphere and so on. All right. So for all these different sources, solar wind, meteoritic, and internal outgassing, they're all inherently variable, and they all have different species that they apply to more so than others. And so it's both a challenge and sort of it's a curse and a blessing in terms of being able to study these types of processes with these different variabilities to try to consider at the same time. Surface temperature-based thermalization has diurnal and latitudinal effects strongly, and as we're aware, the permanently shaded regions are very cold and are some of the more exotic places in the solar system to consider. Loss processes include photoionization and dissociation, thermal genes escape, radiation pressure, and solar wind pickup of subsequent ions that are produced. And the lifetimes of these particles are balanced between the source and the lost timescales, and they typically range from hours to days. Let's talk for a minute about a real localized plume atmosphere, if you will. With the LRO LAMP instrument, we observed the L-cross impact plume. We were very fortunate that the mission was able to time this very well for us. We aligned the lamp slit more or less as you see here relative to the surface of the moon. And this is a few tens of seconds before we crossed over the line of sight that would cross the impact site. But we already saw a burst of plume gas depicted by the shell crossing the line of sight that we saw. And we found that the lamp measurements are a real good data set for constraining detailed plume models. And I'll show a little bit on the next slide of that. But being a UV spectrograph, we were able to disentangle molecular hydrogen and carbon monoxide fluorescence emissions from these 130 to 165 nanometer wavelength spectra. And at longer wavelengths, this emission feature here is explained by atomic mercury with contributions of calcium and magnesium on the wings of this line profile here. So in addition to the water molecules, methane, and other types of materials that the L-cross Shepherding spacecraft observed, with the LRO LAMP instrument, we found some other volatile species released by this impact plume. And we weren't really sure what to expect when we performed this experiment, so we're delighted to see this richness of volatiles in the permanently shaded regions coming out this way. There we go. Here, as I explained, these light curves are very useful for constraining models. Here in red are LAMP data points with error bars plotted as a function of time. And in black, there's a combined model profile that's produced by Dana Hurley here, where she included carbon monoxide, molecular hydrogen, and modeled the expanding plume at different velocities for these different constituents. And it turns out that this gas was streaming out really fast at 4 kilometers per second or so, 3.5 kilometers per second. And a large component was made up of this H2 molecule. And this was surprisingly abundant because it's not thought that the H2 molecule would stick to cold rocks. It's just not very, it's not absorbed very efficiently. So that was interesting. Moving on to more persistent exospheric species that are more global. Here's again the famous image of the sodium corona produced by Drew Potter. And here it's expected that sodium is enhanced near the subsolar point, like you see here, where other species like argon are more localized to the dawn and dust terminator regions, and perhaps more enhanced at the poles, where helium is doing a completely different thing, and it's more enhanced on the Nightside, and thermal accommodation is a more important process for understanding the helium distribution. With LAMP, we had all sorts of good ideas for ways that we could use our UV spectrograph to study the lunar atmosphere. And these are still outstanding questions that we're pursuing. But we, from time to time, move our field of view from the nadir position, which is the default position for all the instruments on LRO, and we take our line of sight and aim right above the lunar limb, like you see here. And this allows us to look through a much longer column of gas illuminated by the sun at these times than we're able to measure in this geometry, for example. And so that makes our measurements more sensitive. And despite our ability to answer all sorts of different questions, we've only had luck to date in detecting atomic helium. And we're still pursuing these other questions, but it's just proven to be a very difficult measurement to make since the densities are so low. here is a spectrum of one such case where we looked above the lunar limb, and we're looking at the line of sight that is just tangent to the limb of the moon above the poles. And we're really excited to report that within these types of observations, we have the first remote detections of lunar helium. These are the first since the Apollo LACE mass spectrometer measured these, discovered these in situ on the lunar surface. Oops, let me go back. And we saw these helium signals in our data set originally, and we had a hard time sifting them out from what could be nearby lunar-related signal from sky background. And I'll describe the sky background a little bit more, but the brightnesses of the two were expected to be about the same. So we came up with an observing technique where we observed along this long line of sight across the poles, and then shortly after kept staring at the same exact point in the sky when we're pointing straight up at the zenith as we cross the equator, and we subtract this background red from the observation in black, and we get this residual blue feature here. And this is attributed to the lunar signal. And sure enough, as our tangent point altitude raised up above the lunar surface, we saw a decrease in the brightness and inferred density, just the way you'd expect for a Chamberlain distributed exosphere. So having confirmed that our LAMP instrument is measuring the helium signals at this type of brightness level, we went and looked at all sorts of other measurements that we have at different viewing geometries, including those that are looking straight nadir. With this confidence in hand, we've been able to extract more observations of the lunar helium surface density. And with this geometry, it's better to integrate over a whole day rather than one orbit at a time or so. And we plot here the day-to-day variations in lunar helium density at the surface. And we see this clear decrease at these times, and then it increases like so. And Dana Hurley will be giving Paul Feldman's talk on this later today in a little more detail. But if you remember Jasper Flakis's talk, where he showed the Artemis spacecraft moving in and out of the Earth's magnetotail, that's what time we're looking at right here. In fact, we used the Artemis quick look data to draw these dashed lines to know when we were in Earth's magnetotail. And you can think of it as the moon sort of going into a lunar eclipse in terms of the helium atoms coming from the sun that the moon sees. And it's a real sharp cutoff in the source of helium at these times. And the time scale for the depletion of the lunar helium exosphere is well modeled by Dana's initial model fits to this geometry, and she can constrain the time scales for the thermal evolution related processes associated with helium in terms of how the atmosphere responds after you get back into the solar wind. So Dana will talk more about that later. Another exciting observation that we've tried is to look for reflectances of continuum emission from dust particles at UV wavelengths. And Dave Lunar showed this plot last year at this conference. And he compared some models that he produced using his Apollo 15 constrained dust models, and Greg Delory showed some of that earlier today. And he showed that the LAMP observations, where we only have upper limits at this point, are already constraining the abundances of exospheric dust elevated above several tens of kilometers. And since then, we've produced some improved observations where we have a better forward scattering angle that lets us be more sensitive to the columns of dust that we're investigating with these types of observations. And here are two such observations on July 20th, 2011 and January 13th, 2012. And you can see these upper limits are improved in terms of the column concentrations that are expected. And they're constraining the dust that's there by an order of magnitude, or 2 orders, if you will, relative to sort of an estimate from these Apollo 15 data. So we have a few more observations from the last month, and we're working to drive these upper limits down even further. All right. So LAMP is sensitive to other species as well, and we're providing new upper limits for other gas species. And it's more difficult work to come up with upper limits, so we'll save that conversation for another day. But we're really puzzled by why we're not observing lunar argon. And even though our instrument sensitivity drops a little bit at this wavelength where argon signals are expected, it really should be sensitive enough to measure those measured by LACE. And so we're trying to figure that out and trying to understand any implications of that. And Alan Stern will have more to talk about that at the DPS meeting coming up. Hydrogen atoms, hydrogen molecules, and water gas constituents also have diagnostic spectral features in the far ultraviolet. And especially with neutral atomic hydrogen gas, the Lyman alpha transition that our instrument is named after is related to this signature. The expectation would be a brightness of half a Rayleigh of light coming off of the lunar hydrogen, if it's there. And this is difficult to separate from 500 Rayleighs of background signal. And it's also complicated by some instrument calibration effects that are time variable right at Lyman alpha. So it's going to take a little more work to answer this question of whether we can measure that or not. But we're finding that H2 and H2O gas are just too low in density to really constrain with the LAMP as it's currently working. So instead, when it comes to these water group volatiles, we will focus instead on the surface reflectance measurements that we do produce with LAMP and that do produce useful results. So I'll move on and talk about that some. All right, so let me guide you through how LAMP works. It's an unusual method for performing observations. We don't use the sun as an illumination source. Instead, we use the interplanetary medium. And I'll show on the next slide a depiction of that. But we have a diffuse illumination source from Starlight and from this interplanetary medium. And so the signals that we would expect reflected off of the surface are more or less the same inside a permanently shaded region as they are outside. There are some topographic effects that we account for, but by and large, that's how this should work. And so any differences that we see can be identified as coming from changes in chemistry, composition meaning, or the microphysics in terms of soil structure, for example. Okay, so here's a depiction of the sky at the Lyman alpha wavelength. This is obtained with the SWAN instrument on the SOHO spacecraft right now. And at Lyman alpha, you see these diffuse emissions in orange and blue, and this is spread across the sky. The red dots here are UV bright stars that also show up. So the sky is aglow at this Lyman alpha wavelength, and there are hydrogen atoms passing in from an interstellar space that basically reflect the sunlight off of them so that we can see them, and then more hydrogen atoms upwind relative to the streaming wind through the solar system. And if our eyes could view at this Lyman alpha wavelength, it would look like an overcast day, completely bright sky, but we'd be observing at twilight because it's relatively dim. And Starlight is another illumination source. It's much dimmer than all this integrated signal from Lyman alpha, but yet it gives us longer wavelength information. And recall here that more UV bright stars are located in the southern hemisphere here. I'll come to that in a second. Okay, so at ultraviolet wavelengths, there's a diagnostic spectral feature for water frost. And we've known this since the Apollo era, where Wagner, Hafke, and Wells did some measurements in the lab to show that there's an absorption edge or band right around 170 nanometers. And the lamp wavelength range that it covers is 57 to 196 nanometers. And so we're well posed to measure off-band and on-band reflectance signals to search for any water frost that could be on the surface. So that's the idea of where we're driving with these permanently shaded region measurements. Next slide, please. So here's our cumulative Nightside Lyman alpha albedo map, and you can see right away these blue features are lower albedos, and you see the familiar Haworth, Shoemaker, Faustini craters all in a row here. And this is a real change in albedo. It's not a shadow from a crater wall or anything like that. This is a real change in ultraviolet color, if you will. North Pole shows similar darkenings with this JPEG. They don't stand out as much. The PSRs are smaller areas there too, so they're a little washed out. But we see these features all over the place. Next slide, please. At longer wavelengths illuminated by starlight, we also see darkenings in the permanently shaded regions here, here, and here. And there's some brighter regions outside of there. But you can tell right away that the starlight illuminated data is noisier, and especially so at the North Pole. It looks gray and white here more because there's missing data that wasn't good enough signal to noise quality to plot here. So we're really just going to focus on the South Pole for today when we discuss these permanently shaded regions. Next slide, please. Comparing our Lyman alpha albedo maps in these UV darkenings to divine air annual average temperature maps, we find pretty good correlations by eye of the coldest permanently shaded regions being where we see our darker FUV albedos. So that's interesting. Next slide, please. Making a similar comparison with the LEN neutron suppression region maps, you see some correlations, but it's maybe more interesting that there aren't more correlations. And I'll remind you that the Shoemaker crater had the deepest suppression of all of these, and that'll be important later on. I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So when we have a diffuse illumination source like we're dealing with for LAMP, what exactly is the albedo that we're measuring? Rather than a spherical or bond albedo, we're talking about a plane albedo, single scattering of all these diffuse photons coming in is the more important parameter to think about. And so Randy Gladstone did some simulations where he took the Shkuratov average moon optical constants and Mashenko et al. Radiative transfer codes, and together with updated particle size distributions by Gogin et al. 2011 with the Rollo dataset analysis he did, he produced these different curves. And while these simulated spectra at the ultraviolet wavelengths for LAMP don't match the data very well, and maybe it wouldn't be expected to, they do provide useful simulations for relative comparisons. And on the next slide, I'll show if we take the next step, and knowing that these plane albedos are the important ones for us to be thinking about. The Hafke 2008 paper that deals with porosity approximations and then can be folded into this type of simulation. And when Randy Gladstone did that, he plotted porosities at 0.3, 5, 0.7, 0.9 in these different colors. And this provides a useful relative comparison. A 0.02 lower albedo at the Lyman alpha wavelength would correspond to a 0.4 higher porosity. And this is the order of magnitude of what we're seeing with our Lyman alpha albedo maps in the permanently shaded regions. So we think that porosity is the better explanation for what we see at the Lyman alpha wavelengths. Okay, thanks. Good. So looking at individual PSRs more closely, it might be hard to see in this view, but looking at the Haworth, Shoemaker, Faustini, these are all relatively dark blue. But when we look at Shackleton, it's brighter, and it's about as bright as the sunlit region surrounding it. So that would imply that Shackleton has less porosity than these other PSRs. We can take the next step and integrate the albedos, the signals that we see in these large regions, Haworth, Shoemaker, Faustini. In the next slides, I'll show spectra obtained for these. We integrate over the Lyman alpha wavelength range. We integrate over a stellar on-band wavelength range from here to here, and then a stellar off-band wavelength range from here to here. And in red, the signal from within the PSR is plotted, and in black, there's a total area outside of the PSRs we're also integrated. And so these provide good relative comparisons. Recall when I talk about on-band and off-band, this is with respect to the water-frost albedo edge, where off-band is expected to be brighter for a water ice presence. And so looking at Lyman alpha, the PSR signal, yes, is darker than outside, and likewise at the stellar on-band range. But when we move to longer wavelengths, there's a relative spectral upturn of what we'll call a reddening at these wavelengths. And if we mix in 1% water frost on the surface, that would explain the relative reddening in these types of measurements. So that's interesting. Next slide, please. We find very similar results with the Faustini albedo. Again, decrease in albedo at Lyman alpha and on-band, and then a spectral reddening off-band. And there the implication would be just shy of 1%. I should say the yellow line here is the previous HUT space shuttle experiment measurement near the subsolar point that shows a general trend like this, which is consistent with the black line, the area outside of the PSRs. And so these relative comparisons are really useful. Next slide, please. When we look at Shoemaker crater, again, we can see maybe higher porosity there. But when we look at the longer wavelengths, our technique really doesn't really say much. We might infer a 0.3% mixing of water ice there, but we don't really have much confidence in that sort of limit. So for practical purposes, we don't really see an enhancement in water frost there. Next slide. So in summary, if you were to integrate with your eye in these types of images, if you take the longer wavelength Haworth craters, so all these green dots here, and you compare them with the shorter stellar illuminated signals here, it's notably dark or brighter here at the longer wavelengths, and that's consistent with water frost there. Shoemaker crater, however, doesn't show that type of enhancement, and that's hard to reconcile with the LEND results, which show more neutron suppression right here. But yet, this is a consistent result, finding 1 to 2% abundances of water frost right at the surface. When you consider that the M cubed and other infrared measurements on the day side measured less than 0.5% water absorption by abundance, and within the L cross impact plume, there's about 5% water abundance. This 1 to 2% value is right in between the two, and we're really studying the transition region where one flows into the next. All right, next slide. Just briefly, I'll show, since LAMP is a photon integrating instrument, as we collect more and more signals throughout the course of the mission, we can extend our measurements to lower and lower latitudes, and we have some good data there by now. And these are 240 meter by 240 meter pixel maps, kind of like the WAC or Diviner resolution. Next slide, please. When we zoom in on these types of regions, yeah, it's a little slow. You can see brightenings of these crater walls there, and this was expected from Apollo 17 UVS measurements. Next slide, if you didn't hear me. Yeah, so it's reassuring that at these lower latitudes, we don't see albedos as low as we do within the PSR. So our story really does hold up there. And when we look at these other lower latitude regions, I'll point you to Amanda Hendricks' talk on Thursday, where she's looked at some dayside spectra and analyzed those. All right. Next slide. That's my summary slide. So to sum up, LAMP is mapping out and searching for water frost exposed on the surface, right on the top 100 nanometers or so within the permanently shaded regions. We've been successful at fingerprinting this water frost signature there. We've also been able to identify higher porosity or fluffiness that might be consistent with fairy castle structures of dust and volatiles in these types of regions. I'll end right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Brad. Thank you. Interesting talk. Let's take time for one brief question. Bill, want to wait for the mic?
Yeah, we'll be brief. For the thin layer of frost that you saw, or the 1 or 2% frost on the surface, that's presumably is not inconsistent with the LEND data, but I'm wondering how thick must it be for you to get the signal? Is it
right? So
a very short, very thin layer?
To explain more, yeah, this in UV, the photons really only penetrate half a wavelength or so. It's not like an infrared photon. And so for a Lyman alpha photon at 12-16 angstroms, rule of thumb is it's going into the top 60 nanometers. So it's a very different region that we're probing with our different techniques. So yes, it's all good.
Okay, thanks again, Kurt. All right, we now have the treat of our next round of lightning talks, and Brad Bailey, can you please come up and